Thank you very much, Lynn. If you're just tuning in now, this is a live broadcast with LaRouche Pack TV. It's a regular Friday night broadcast. Mr. LaRouche has just finished his opening remarks, and now we're going to have some discussion with two members of our audience gathered in the studio, Jason Ross and Leandra Bernstein. So I'd like to ask Jason to come to the podium first.
Well, and I got a question that comes from an institutional contact, and it relates to what you were bringing up about Ezekiel Emanuel. On a January 3rd report called Growth Forecast Errors and Fiscal Multipliers, which is kind of a... Anyway, that's their title. The head of the IMF, the head economist of the IMF, Olivier Blanchard, had a sort of a mea culpa. He said that in Greece in particular, which implemented the policies of the IMF, the fund had assumed that for every dollar in cuts, there would only be a 50-cent reduction in output in the economy. What they found was that instead, for every dollar in cuts, the overall economy collapsed by more than that, by at least $1.50. So that meant that every cut in spending, far from reducing any budget deficit, actually increased it. Now, these cuts in taxes have included a 25 to 50% cut in pensions, a 50% reduction in the minimum wage. There's been an 80% drop in the purchase of heating oil due to its cost, and air pollution in Athens has increased by 400% due to people going to the lower technology of wood for heat. So the conclusions of the IMF really should come as no surprise. There is a point in the economy where all the fat's been cut, and any further cuts dismantle and take apart the physical productivity of the economy, and that point was reached long ago. Today, unemployment in Greece is around 26.8%. It's reaching similar levels in Spain, and the U.S. under Obama appears obviously headed in precisely the same direction. Just recently, Obama named Esther Duflo as a member of his President's Global Development Council. Duflo was part of the team that put together these disastrous policies in Europe. So here's the question. What do you see would be the consequence if we adopted these austerity policies in the U.S., and what's the alternative?
Well, I'll tell you what the policies are. It's just what I just talked about. Exactly what I was just talking about. That they're economic policies which promote death, poverty, disease, death, so forth, and in mass insanity. When the whole issue of this always comes out with money. People want money, they say. But when they how do you choose money, and what do you use it for, and how do you use it if you're not a clown, or a very bad kind of clown? So the way the world is being run, as long as it's under the control of the imperial forces represented by the combination of Britain, the British monarchy, British system, and the Saudi system. The British and Saudi system is in 9/11. Remember that in the original 9/11 event, the event itself was organized by the British BAE Corporation in cooperation with the Saudi kingdom. That's how it was done. And the Saudi ambassador to New York, to Washington, was one of the active organizers of both the pilots and other sources used for 9/11. Then, of course, that government, the Bush government of that time, actually put through the cover-up on the known information collected, which demonstrated that the Saudis and the British together, through the BAE, were entirely responsible for the events of the 2001 9/11 event. We have similarly a 9/11 event. How did it become a 9/11 event in Benghazi? The current president of the United States did that. And the same presidency also voted for a suppression of any discussion of the evidence proving the original authorship of the original 9/11 operation. So you have a British-Saudi operation, which is responsible actually for both 9/11s. Now that issue is up for discussion right now, and they're trying to hold it off. But the fact is, we know the evidence so far. We know that the President of the United States himself, by implication, and what people don't tell you and what they do can both be equally the same thing. Someone who denies or tries to cover up what they did is just as guilty as if they had confessed to doing it. And when you get into this kind of stuff, like Hitler-like stuff, then the rules get tougher, because you cannot assume there's honest error or even negligent error. There's deliberate murder. And deliberate murder is to be treated as deliberate murder. And you cannot, when you have somebody saying, I don't know what's going on here, when you have a president who's ordering mass murders every week in various parts of the world, and he hasn't brought it in here publicly yet, but he will. And we've come to that point. So that's what the issue is. We have to understand what money ought to mean. Money, generically, money in all its accepted manifestations. It means excluding, for example, gold and silver, platinum, because these are interchangeable things which have an intrinsic value, as these metals have an intrinsic value, because they're useful. You don't have to spend them as money. You can burn them down, melt them down, and sell them as platinum, sell them as gold, sell them as silver. And that's a form of money. It's not a very good one, but it's been used in past times, and it's money. But paper money, well, that's a question mark. When is paper money money, and when ain't it? And there is a difference, because money which is only paper money, or similar kinds of paper or agreements, is not really wealth. It's credit. Now, the problem has been, in the United States in particular, especially since 2007, when we went in 2008 into hyperinflation in the United States. It was voted in, and I scolded Bill Clinton hard for his consenting to that, to his giving his voice to that. But in that case, today, what's coming out with Geithner and so forth, who's now departing, right? long before he should be gone. But when you use money as money, and use paper money or invisible paper money, which is more common these days with the whole program, there's no value whatsoever. Now, what happens if you take non-money, because it's only credit or non-credit? The only credit for it is more non-credit. In other words, when you go purely on money and build up all these ascending columns of so-called money, which is only circulated as the same kind of money, with no actual production, useful production engaged, what you're doing, every time you increase the money supply from the corporations that deal with money investments, you are shrinking the incomes of the entire population. In other words, the more rapidly you grow with this kind of money, runaway money, which is money exchanged for money only, you are not getting wealth. You're not getting value. You're impoverishing and ruining and breaking up the economy. So we have to get rid of this idea that money has an intrinsic value. But also the point is, even gold and silver and platinum, when used as money, are not very useful, because by their very nature they're just swapped around. They don't go into the production of anything. As a matter of fact, if they use in that way, they take away value, not increase it. So the only kind of money that's worth anything, real money, is credit. Alexander Hamilton's idea of credit, period. That was taken as a constitutional principle because he solved the problem. The United States had won its freedom, was sovereign nation, but they were bankrupt as the costs of war and so forth, and the persecution by an enemy power called the British Empire. How are we going to get money? How are we going to buy things? How are we going to get an income? And Alexander Hamilton proved in his 3 famous statements exactly how you do this thing. So Alexander Hamilton made the Americans intelligent on money. And then when they killed Alexander Hamilton, it was a murder. It was not just a duel, it was a murder. Hamilton discharged his weapon upward. Then the assassin shot him, and he died from that. Now, the assassin was about to be brought to trial for that murder, and the charge was murder. The perpetrator escaped to Canada and to Britain and stayed there for some time in safety. But Aaron Burr, the perpetrator, who was a British agent, who was housed in Britain with the British royalty and the British government, who acted as a spy against the United States on behalf of the British monarchy, the British Empire, for all of his life. He introduced British banking with the case of Andrew Jackson. British banking was brought in to take over the United States by British bankers who were going to pull a great swindle against the United States, and did. The United States was bankrupted by the Jackson administration, entirely bankrupted. And his successor was even more evil than he was. And the United States never really escaped from the effect of the Jackson term, and was really organized by the British agent Aaron Burr. And Andrew Jackson was a sub-agent of Aaron Burr. The president was. And the successor president was an agent of Aaron Burr. And I had a bunch in the New York area, and in Boston. You had a bunch of people out there who were all bankers, and they were all controlled by the British monarchy's banking system. So the United States was actually controlled. Under this mechanism, slavery was introduced to the United States, black slavery on a mass scale. States were destroyed. The Constitution was subverted and violated. And it was not until the Revolutionary or the Civil War that the United States got its freedom back, even the freedom of the nation. Then we had more of this, British bankers. You had a great president who was assassinated, and the vice president, who was a British agent, Theodore Roosevelt, was actually an agent of the Confederacy circle. Woodrow Wilson was the guy who brought into being again the Ku Klux Klan, bigger than ever before, and he was the president. And these guys made policy up until the time that Franklin Roosevelt became president. And as soon as Franklin Roosevelt was dead, they began to destroy the United States in the same fashion again. And I saw every bit of the operation. So that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with this kind of situation where we have an enemy power, a standing enemy of the United States since its Constitution was established. And that enemy, that British enemy, now augmented by Saudi elements of the same British system, of the British Empire, are now dominating the world and are seeking and have been seeking to destroy our United States. And we have been scarce in the number of Americans who would think clearly about this thing. But I think there are leading Americans and others today who, looking at the facts, and I certainly do try to get those facts across to them the best I can, who would recognize what patriotism is. And you find that in France even, and even in Britain, you find people who, in terms of banking, are thinking of a banking reform. And they're thinking of a banking reform which is based on the principle of a credit system, just as Franklin Roosevelt used a credit system to save the United States from bankruptcy back when he was president. The time has come that we'll get our morals back if we get our money back, which means, Glass-Steagall means you cancel government responsibility for all kinds of banking which do not correspond to our principle, our constitutional principle. That money is going to be simply set there. And these bankers, that class, they're simply going to be left on the beach. If they can make money on the beach, earn it honestly, well, more power to them. If they go bankrupt doing that, more power to them. But we're going to save our United States. We're going to establish a credit system of the type that was defined by the then first Treasury Secretary of the United States. And that's the solution. And so the various kinds of evil that we face, or stupidity that we face, sometimes stupidity is also a pure evil, is the issue here. And the question is, do we have the guts and intelligence to do what we have the power to do as a people, under a leadership perhaps of only 5% of the total population, but a 5% of really thinking people in the population, if they have a good conscience too, is enough to organize a lot of the rest of the people to move in a useful direction. And I think that's where we are now.